So as the title of this video implied, this is going to be a spoiler discussion of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. If you haven't seen it, go do that and then come back, please. If you haven't seen the movie, I'm about to spoil very big things, so no people who haven't seen the movie beyond this point. Is everybody ready? Okay, normally a line like this would be something that you wouldn't be missing anything if you forgot. But Spot calls the ATM an ATM machine, and Miles asks, why do you call it an ATM machine? The M stands for machine. And later in the film, again, this line would be something you could forget about and not be missing anything, but Miles refers to chai as chai tea. I forget his name, but the Indian Spider-Man goes off on him for saying chai tea because it's like saying tea, kind of like how saying ATM machine is like saying automated teller machine. On their own, those lines are almost nothing from a storytelling perspective, but in this particular film, they actually demonstrate something. The way Miles has been treating the Spot is so similar to the way that the other Spider-Man treat him. Like, he wants to be included and involved and have a big part of the story, and the other Spider-Man just says, you use words wrong. Miles and the Spot are both saying, this is my story, take me seriously please, and everyone's just counting them out. I like how Spot is a character that you'd think would be nothing to worry about, just like Miles thinks he's nothing to worry about. And because Miles doesn't take him seriously, he ends up being a huge problem. Miles was saying, I think we've seen the last of him, don't worry about that. They just had a conversation about Miles instead of talking about how he ruined the Spot's life and the fact that he's been so obsessed with himself and calling it his story that he didn't take the Spot seriously. That's what's going to be his downfall, possibly, because the Spot is trying to kill his dad now, and he's actually capable of being a big bad final boss now. Because at the beginning of the film, you can't imagine him being the final boss, but then they get to that scene where he absorbs the power from the Indian Collider, and he gets that anime villain pose, and you think, okay, now he can be the final boss, sure. Miles considers the Spot a nobody, someone you can just ignore and get away with, and the other Spider-Men see him as a mistake. Well, specifically, Miguel O'Hara does, and he thinks everything would be better without Miles, and he's not even considering him to join his crew. Meanwhile, someone else can be recruited when they've only been Spider-Man for 6 months, which, by the way, his mom said that he would get into fancy places and people would say that he doesn't belong there, and that's exactly what happens. At the beginning of the film, the Spot is talking about how Miles ruined his life, and how he can't get a job, and how he's hideously disfigured, and how each of them gave the other person their powers. And Miles cares more about the fact that the Spot said ATM machine than the fact that he ruined his life. They never spell this out, but you know that they knew if it were Peter in that situation, he would have reacted very differently to the Spot. He would have said, that's terrible, I'm so sorry for what happened to you, let me help you, I'm trying to help you, you're my eyes and ears. And I hope they have Miles realize that in Beyond the Spider-Verse, and maybe he'll be asking himself, was it a mistake for me to be Spider-Man? Was Miguel O'Hara right about me? If it had been Peter in that situation, he would have stopped all this. Now the Spot's going to kill my dad. Not only does he have that to make him feel bad about himself, there's also the ending of the film. He goes to the dimension where there's never been a Spider-Man, and everything's gone to ruin, but there is a Prowler who's him from that dimension. They never really clarified what exactly the Prowler has been doing in that dimension where there's no Spider-Man. Which, by the way, I totally saw it coming that he was going to be sent to the wrong dimension, because when Miles goes to the machine that sends him to the different dimension, you see on the screen 42, and that was the number on the spider that was from the alternate dimension that bit Miles. So on Earth 42, it could be that Miles, as Prowler, has been trying to help the city. They never really they never specified what he's been doing as the Prowler, so it could be that he's some sort of anti-hero who's trying to clean up the city a little bit with no Spider-Man around. And if that's the case, Miles is going to have to grapple with the fact that this world hasn't had Peter Parker, but it has had him, but that hasn't been good enough. And then, of course, Gwen is going to have to be the one to cheer him up, or Peter. But speaking of Gwen, I love the smeared watercolor effects in Spider-Gwen's world. I love how Gwen feels like she can't be close to people, so she pushes them away until she's left with only her dad, and then her dad pushes her away. So she's gotten into this defeatist mentality, thinking that she can't be close to anyone. And I think one of the reasons that she let herself consider Miles a friend was because she knew that she wouldn't be able to see him for very long. So she wouldn't have the time to hurt him the way that she hurt her world's Peter. But of course, Miles is more persistent in pursuing a relationship with Gwen, so she goes into the portal thinking that she's never going to see Miles again. But then Miles follows after her. So Miles keeps pursuing a relationship with Gwen despite the fact that he has no time. Miles can barely even get a cake to a party because he has to make 2 or 3 stops to do Spider-Man stuff. He's not holding it together as it is. He's getting a B- or B in Spanish, and yet he's asking for more work joining the Spider-Man crew simply because he wants to spend more time with Gwen. And the fact that he's so persistent with Gwen inspires Gwen, because later she goes back to her dad's apartment, and at first she says something aggressive and he walks away like that. I guess that's the end of it. But then, if I'm interpreting things correctly, she was inspired by Miles's persistence. So she's like, "No, come back here, Dad." And then they have their makeup session, and then she goes off to help Miles. The cliffhanger we're left with, besides the premise of going to a world that's never had Spider-Man that does have Miles Morales as the Prowler, which sounds interesting, there's also the premise that Miguel O'Hara thinks that Miles Morales' dad has to die in order for their universe to not explode, because it's a canon event. Now, they did bring up that Miguel could be wrong about how canon events work. In fact, you can argue that when he accidentally destroyed that other dimension by moving in there, that wasn't really disrupting a canon event. That sounds more like an incursion, as they explained in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which, by the way, it's heavily implied that Spider-Verse takes place in the same multiverse as the MCU, which to me that creates a plot hole, because if that's the case, then why aren't other people glitching when they go to alternate dimensions in the MCU movies the way they do in the Spider-Verse movies? But anyway, it could just be that because Miguel was living in the wrong dimension for too long, that's what set off the end of that dimension, and not the fact that he disrupted a canon event. And Gwen is easier to root for in this scenario because she's saying maybe Miguel is wrong to think that canon events work that way. Maybe I'm just reading into things, but when she has her talk with her dad and he says that he's not the police captain anymore, the most likely thing that means is that because he's not the captain anymore, he's not gonna die in a canon event, because one of the canon events is the police captain dies. But it could be that she was thinking that if he didn't die as a police captain, like he's not the police captain anymore, so it's too late for him to die as a police captain. Maybe because that happens, that means that the police captain doesn't have to die, and if the police captain doesn't die, the universe won't end. I don't know, I might have been reading in too much. Maybe it just meant someone else can die as a police captain and Gwen doesn't care so much about that. Miles is a bit more morally ambiguous in this scenario, in my opinion, because he doesn't have an argument about the rest of his dimension being okay if he doesn't let his dad die, but he still wants to save his dad. Like, he's willing to sacrifice the entire dimension over his dad, which either he's willing to sacrifice his entire dimension or he's just being stubborn about not wanting to sacrifice anything. A question I had just from watching the trailers is, why is Miguel O'Hara the only Miguel O'Hara in his army of Spider-Men? At first it seemed like the answer was he's the only Miguel O'Hara that got spider powers, kind of like Gwen. But I think the reason he's the only one is because he developed some self-loathing from accidentally destroying that other dimension. So that's why he hasn't wanted to recruit any other Miguel O'Haras, because he doesn't want to be surrounded with more of himself. I mean, obviously Peter Parker is Spider-Man Prime, even in the 2099 universe. Miguel O'Hara is basing his brand off of the original Spider-Man, which is Peter Parker. So it makes sense for Peter Parker to be most of the Spider-Men in the Spider Army, but still, in an infinite multiverse, you'd think that there'd be infinite everything and thus infinite Miguel O'Haras that have spider powers. I feel like that statement needs a whiteboard explanation. Hang on. The way they have the multiverse set up is one dimension can branch off into infinite realities. They started with one timeline and then it branches off infinitely. So if we have one dimension in which Miguel O'Hara becomes Spider-Man, that stands to reason that there would also be an infinite number of split-offs from that, and thus an infinite number of Miguel O'Hara Spider-Men. So I'm pretty sure that he could have recruited other Miguel O'Haras, but he just didn't want to. The other Miguel O'Haras might make the same mistake he made that destroyed a dimension, and that fuels his rivalry with Miles, because when he says Miles is a mistake, he's probably been saying the same thing to himself. Peter and Mayday Parker are the opposite extreme of the problem I had with them in the Spider-Girl comics. I tried to read the Spider-Girl comics series, I just couldn't with that series. Not only was the dialogue atrocious, the problem I had with Peter Parker was he's telling his daughter, you can't be a superhero even though I was a superhero when I was your age. And here you have Across the Spider-Verse where he's literally bringing the baby along with him to superhero business. It might sound wacko, but it beats the hypocritical alternative. Going back to what I said about Miles and Gwen and their defeatism versus persistence mentality, I think they sum it up with that conversation where Gwen says, in every other universe, Gwen Stacy falls for Spider-Man and it ends terribly. And Miles says, well, maybe it'll work out better this time. She says it never works, and he says we could try to make it work anyway. And that comes back when she decides not to give up on him or his dad's at the end of the movie. I would not say this to someone who loved Into the Spider-Verse but has not seen Across the Spider-Verse yet. But personally, I liked Across the Spider-Verse more than Into the Spider-Verse, and that's something, again, that's, if you say that to someone who loves Into the Spider-Verse but hasn't seen Across the Spider-Verse, they're going to get sky-high expectations, which might be disappointed. However, there is one thing in Across the Spider-Verse that's worse than it was in Into the Spider-Verse. Miles' costume. Woof. I think Peter sums it up pretty well when he says it looks like he's bleeding from his armpits. But there's a ray of hope, because if he changes his costume for every movie, then that means he's going to have a different costume for Beyond the Spider-Verse. I hope they don't try to push the idea of Miles being the best Spider-Man. That's just going to make Peter Parker fans, self-included, resent Miles for being declared the best and better. There was that scene where he said that he beat all the Spider-Men, and I'm like, no, you escaped all the Spider-Men, you did not beat them all. I wanted this video to be discussing the themes of the story and stuff that not everyone might have thought of when watching the movie, so that's why I haven't been gushing about all the obvious stuff, like Spectacular Spider-Man being included in this movie. That was a nice touch, even though he didn't get to do too much, but that's okay. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and look forward to Beyond the Spider-Verse.